Thanks for inviting me. It's great to finally get over here. I've been meaning to all year. Um, this has been a good occasion for me to break out of my habits. So I'm really pleased you came today. I'm going to present this paper. It's with Brenda Myung, who's right here. And so I won't be able to blame her for all the shortcomings of the paper like I usually do. But we'll be certainly taking notes and looking forward to your feedback. So I'm organizational sociologist by training. I work in a business school. I am accustomed to both the norms of economics and sociology. My preference is somewhere in between the two in terms of audience engagement. If I go on talking too long, I feel really boring. Um, and that will make me self-conscious. So please do interrupt, make it conversational. Though I do like to, get past the title slide before the critiques start. So that's, please, conversation. So just a little bit of background. Originally, the idea for this paper was to take what we see a lot in organizational theory or strategy in business schools is sort of this partial import of sociology into the field of management more broadly, sort of taking pieces of theory that seem to serve the purpose, or more cynically to explain some regression results, but not really the full idea. And so the idea is to kind of like complete the import from what I'll just refer to as structural sociology, the idea that there's a structure out there, which I know is obvious to many of us, but not necessarily in management. And so we really wrote this, the first version of the paper was really focused on like trying to bring this into strategy and management. I think as I've gone and presented the paper and we've talked more, Brendan and I have decided to make it more broad in terms of its orientation to an organizational audience, less so strategy. So you'll see some little, I'm going to try and be consistent with terminology and everything like that, but I might slip. Okay. All right. So the idea is, oh, this is not working now. Yep. I think this might be out of pattern. Oh, there we go. Yeah, okay. All right. So there we go. Okay. So let's start with the basic motivation. One of the examples of this is what's called the status-based model of market competition. This is an idea that Joel Podolny brought into organizational theory in the 90s. This idea that there are benefits of being in high status positions. In any sort of hierarchy, those at the top have some benefits. And in markets, that manifests as status is a signal of quality, so people are willing to pay more for it. Consumers have higher willingness to pay for the goods of high status than low status producers. Similarly, because of that, there's lower marketing costs. You have to spend less to persuade consumers of high quality. And so there's this idea that you take goods of actual equivalent quality, and the higher the status of the producer, the higher the price they can charge, the lower their costs, and so therefore the higher their profits. All right, so this is this idea that these structural positions have competitive advantages in markets, okay? This also comes out in the work on interorganizational networks. So take a bunch of firms and we connect them to each other much as we would an interpersonal network, and use the structural metaphors that those that are more central in the network, that is, it's often used as an indicator of how high status or prominent the organization is, tend to perform better, all right, for a variety of reasons. And I'll get into some of those mechanisms in a little bit. But the general idea is that if you are central in a network, I'm sorry, not you, if a firm or an organization is central in a network, all right, that there are these benefits in terms of access to resources. There are these benefits, sort of perceptual benefits, the way that others perceive you, et cetera, okay? And so this is a sort of tried and true empirical fact, and it's often cast as the firms that are more central are better than the firms that are peripheral. For whatever reason, whatever determines returns or performance in that context, they're better at it, okay? And so it's this idea, this is what I would call the partial import, that, structure is not just about the advantages of position, but also the determinants of position. and how some actors are of course, more likely to be in those positions than others. And that's the part that's been left out of management. It's just sort of convenient to explain performance differentials. Yeah. So if I could summarize this, and this is, grossly simplified, all right, but generally the logic is if we look at performance differentials, which is the core theoretical question of strategic management, why do some firms outperform others? Well, it's generally a story about what I'll call superior capabilities, or I'll reframe as merit, okay, if an organization can have merit, that they're better at something. And so therefore, because they have superior capabilities, they're in better positions, and those positions are associated with higher performance. Okay, so that's our baseline. And, I don't think it is an oversimplification, but not too much of one, to say that that's generally the way the literature has been written, okay? And to give you a few examples, I made the bad choice to put the citations to all these papers here one time, and then I haven't updated it since. But you can get a sense of, how prevalent just network centrality as an indicator of structural position, often theorized as status or prominence, but measured as centrality, is associated with organizations growing faster, learning more, innovating more, having more market power, forming more partnerships, surviving longer. There are all these performance benefits associated with being central, okay? And these performance benefits are attributed to capabilities, like they're more alert or responsive. They are better at collaborating or better at forming or managing partnerships. Okay, so there's a question. Yes. Yeah, I think in economics we call those rents. Yeah. Uh, it's a performance outcome in strategy. Yes. Yeah. And I will get into a little bit of whether or not these are returns versus rents, and I think that's part of the tension. Yeah. Please. Yeah. A variety of things. It could be, a strategic alliance. It could be a citation to a patent. It could be, as I'm going to use here, affiliations to higher education institutions or other organizations. There's both, there's a variety of two-mode to one-mode conversions that are used in the literature. Yeah, but it's generally taking this structural metaphor and saying, well, the reason they're central is they must be better than those are peripheral. That's the general logic. Yeah. Okay, good. These are the kinds of things I take for granted, and so I appreciate the questions to clarify. So the idea here is generally these sort of vague kind of capabilities, and this is a general critique of the strategy literature, that, performance is often explained as the function of resources or capabilities, and resources are much more concrete, easily measured, and capabilities are oftentimes inferred from outcomes. Yeah. Okay. All right, so the idea here is to take this, something that, is established. We're going to do my classic replication. I can produce the same result that's been produced in the past, and now let's sort of take that apart, okay? All right, and the way, our way of doing this is taking this idea that if superior capabilities are the merit frame, then superior opportunities would be the privilege frame, right? And this is something that those of us who have taken a basic sociology class, right? Choices and constraints, structure, et cetera, this is sort of secondhand, it's natural to theorize about this. The networks literature in particular has characterized how these relationships reproduce broader inequalities in terms of access to education, employment, et cetera, right? And so this is the idea that we're sort of introducing and using to question, why do we see so consistently this upward sloping relationship between position and performance? And I want to talk about it as structural position more broadly than just network position, but network is a measure. And so as I slip between those two, know that we are thinking broadly here, okay? And so if I could recharacterize this, well, whereas before we had this idea that performance is attributed to position, which is a function of capabilities, well, now we say, well, privilege is really a story about superior opportunities that are based on social identity and background, conditioning, in particular, education, employment opportunities. All right, and so the contrast we want to present here is really quite simple. All right, it's something that we talk about colloquially, right? That there is merit and privilege. It's often more rhetorical. We're trying to make this empirical. Okay, and so the idea is, and this is my fancy PowerPoint trick of the day. I had network centrality here on the x-axis before. Now we're going to flip it and put it on the y-axis. This is my subtle way of posing the endogeneity critique to management audiences without using the word, all right? But the idea that, you know, some are more central because they have superior opportunities is a privileged story. And both of these seem to have some truth to them. You know, I don't think this is either or, all right? And we're explicitly trying to treat this as a and also kind of proposition.
I can see two possible ways to say this. One is to say those firms really do have flexibility. It's just that the capabilities are determined by their superior opportunities. The other is to say they don't really have bigger abilities. It's just that they have other things that before both.
Both. Yeah. I think the way we'd like to say it is I don't deny that some firms are better at value creating activities than others. Yeah, I think that would not be reasonable. But I also don't think that that's all that explains the performance differential. And so I have a little conceptual figure here that I'll try and you know, say what we're trying to do. My goal here is to try and make it seem like what we're doing is something so modest that nobody could disagree with it. Thus far, I've been unsuccessful in achieving that goal, but we'll see how this goes. Yeah. So the idea here is simply, let's take, you know, status characteristics theory. We'll take two kinds of characteristics, both ascribed and achieved. All right, those that are, you know, given. All right, they're exogenously determined. They're time invariant for the most part. All right, but we could take ascribed characteristics like racialized identity, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. We can take achieved characteristics like education, employment, and say both of these are generally the basis for superior access to opportunities. And so if, for example, we're able to demonstrate that some of the performance differentials are systematically correlated with these characteristics, then that raises questions about whether or not there are sort of capability differences across these groups, or alternatively, there are opportunity differences, which I think is the far more plausible interpretation, okay? And so to frame this, we draw upon Collins's work on educational stratification, many of you will be familiar with. He contrasts this idea between a technical functional account, which was sort of the old school stratification theories of Davis and Moore, that some people have more and they're rewarded more because they do the work that society values most, and to encourage them to get education and experience. Therefore, rewards are attached to those positions, et cetera, okay? And so this is the baseline against which, you know, that serves as our sort of merit interpretation. It's really, all we're doing here is really just reinterpreting this technical functional explanation as one that says just that firms have superior capabilities, okay? And alternatively saying, well, there's also this conflict theory that there are these historical inequities, cultural reproduction, et cetera, that we really wouldn't necessarily consider superior capabilities, but superior opportunities. And so this is our contrast between merit and privilege. And so the idea here is to take these as sort of two extremes, and to Sasha's point, allow for both to have some explanatory power when it comes to performance differentials, and coming up with an empirical approach that, you know, can persuasively delineate the two. That's the idea, okay? All right, so let me try this with my conceptual figure here, all right? So if this is the status quo interpretation where we take firms, we put them in terms of their network centrality, we could do the same thing with status. It looks the same, just relabel the axis, all right? And we characterize their performance. And the status quo interpretation is that those firms are better. They're better at recognizing opportunities, exploiting opportunities. They're better at forming partnerships. They're better at innovating, et cetera, okay? And that's why Apple and Google are performing much better than competitors. And our proposed interpretation here, and this is not drawn to any scale, it's just sort of my PowerPoint limitations, that this area under the curve, really, a reasonable interpretation would be that, yeah, there's some merit story here. There probably are capability differences, but there are also some opportunities, and specifically opportunities that are related to those characteristics, which I'm now calling ZI. I was calling them AI before, and that was really problematic. So now that was a big change in the slides, Brenda. I put I made that a Z. Yeah, that's my sort of tweak to say that these are omitted variables and other research. Yes, please.
I control the composition of different defenses, get a fixed effect on rating, immigration data, not merit, right? The reason why I brought the rent example is the one thing I respect about economics approach to that, as opposed to everything is doing that, I think, but at least if say we have a counterfact with this model of pure perfect composition, you're taking the form and not the latter, right?
I always get confused on former ladder. Yeah, 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 yeah. So we're going to try and do this differently than what you just described. I'm going to get confused again with former ladder, but idea is not just to control away all that we can control and progressively add more and more to the regression specification, but rather to interpret the firm fixed effects and the residuals as theoretically meaningful evidence of mechanisms. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm going to start with the baseline and then say, well, okay, if we can reproduce the baseline, but now we're going to put organization fixed effects in here. Well, that could be consistent with both merit and privilege. But some of these stories, specifically the ones about superior capabilities, should have implications for the behavior of the residuals that we're going to try and analyze as well. And that's where I like the approach, but I'm not satisfied with it. I think in some ways it's not fully fair to the organizations, but we'll get there. Yeah. So I'm going to try and do more than just control. Yeah. Okay. So the idea is, can we somehow decompose this effect into theoretically different, distinct components? Yeah. And I'm not going to put a whole lot on the effect size estimates or the functional form of this, but rather, is there something that suggests, hey, the area under that curve is at least two things? Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is where I'll introduce the mechanisms that we're associating with these accounts. I don't think these are exhaustive, but I think that they are distinct, and I feel comfortable testing them. And I do think that they're general in terms of applying this to established markets. Yeah. All right. So for the privilege, here's where we'll call this rents, right? That because you're in this position, you get to be in this position, you have superior access. All right. So there's an access mechanism here where the privileged enjoy preferential access to superior opportunities. And so therefore, of course, you know, when you're dealt a different hand, a better hand, you have higher performance. All right. And this is how we're going to start with this, trying to characterize opportunities in terms of their quality, right, or expected performance, and then looking at the distribution of opportunities across actors in the system, all right, and how that is related to performance differentials, yeah? And we're going to distinguish that from merit, which I'm here using the rhetoric of rents and returns, that this is what's classically thought of as returns to superior capabilities. So what might those be? Well, one is that, look, if there are all these opportunities available and some are systematically selecting the best among them, we might say that they have selection capabilities. That is, they're good at choosing, all right? Whereas the axis is really in the spirit of the constraint story. This would be more about agency or choice, right? That we can select the best opportunities. And it's also possible that even if, you know, everyone has equivalent opportunities, some firms are better at developing those opportunities into what causes performance, right? And you can see this in studies of entrepreneurship, for example, where, You take a bunch of people who have access to the same technology, and then they come up with ideas, and their ideas differ, and some of those ideas are more promising than others. All right, this is consistent with that kind of mechanism. All right. And so what we're going to try and do is come up with a test, or a series of tests, and the econometrics is going to get a little bit, well, messy. I probably made mistakes on the subscripts again, but I think you'll follow the logic. All right. The idea is, can we characterize differences in opportunities, which we might associate with either access or selection? Yeah. And then we're going to have to make some assumptions about, is that conditional on observables or unobservables? And then once we condition on the opportunities, are there differences in terms of the realized performance thereafter? All right. And that's how we're going to try and sort out merit and privilege. We're going to do this in a context where I think it's reasonable to say that we can do this. I think it's also reasonable to expect that you could do it in other contexts. Yeah. Okay. Clear? More or less? Okay. All right. So the propositions then will be this. All right. So this is just our baseline. Okay. So our baseline is, look, we're going to take network centrality as our measure of position. We could easily call that status, within this literature, but I think that what we're really just theorizing about is advantageous positions more broadly. Okay. And so we're going to take that network centrality measure and reproduce the position performance effect. And then we're going to correlate with described and characteristics of organizational members at entry. All right. And we're going to do this with new entrants into the market because, at least at time zero, we can say that they have no position like within the sampling frame. They're starting with something, whereas, once you start going with established organizations, well, then we have cumulative advantage processes, et cetera, that's harder to deal with. All right. So we're going to take new entrants. All right. And this will be our baseline. And say we get this, that we see this correlation between those characteristics, our Z's. Well, that would be both consistent with both the merit and the privilege accounts. You can produce that with any of those three mechanisms. So that doesn't necessarily provide us with any, exclusive evidence. All right. But the privilege story suggests that, well, the greater the privilege, the more that opportunity quality should increase with those same characteristics. And again, that doesn't tell us if it's, constraint or choice, right? If it's superior access to opportunities or selecting the best of the litter, all right? And so what we're going to do is probe further on the merit story, which is, if we have greater capabilities, then we should observe greater performance to observationally equivalent opportunities. That is, if we could just take opportunity, hold it constant, and see that some are still outperforming, even once we account for whether it's access or selection in the first stage, and that second stage they're outperforming, well, then we're really getting at a capability story. It's either they're choosing better opportunities on unobservables, or they're taking equivalent opportunities and making them better, which I will argue that we should attribute to merit, that at least in superior capabilities, maybe not in the broader sort of social definition of merit. Yeah. Okay, so the idea is this. All right, I'm going to try and restate it more clearly. We're going to reproduce effects, well-established effects in the literature. Our data behaves much like everyone else's. Then we're going to decompose that, all right, and say, well, the implications of privilege are what opportunities an organization has, what opportunities it realizes. That doesn't exclusively tell us about privilege. It could be either choice or constraint. But what you should see, if this is really a capability story, and this is where the residuals come in, is that once we condition on the opportunities available to these organizations, well, they should be doing better than anticipated, systematically better than anticipated. All right, and so that's what we're going to try and do, is set up an econometric approach that allows us to interpret the pattern here is more or less consistent with a merit or privilege story. And I'll give you the punchline now. It's that we think it's more consistent with a privilege story, but the results are not as compelling as we might like. All right. I think that might be because there are things we can do in terms of making assumptions and testing the privilege story that I think we have to do to make the final result more compelling. that might make sense later on, but certainly more sense. Yes, please.
You'll probably get into this, but when you're talking about equalizing opportunities, are you also like looking at that as
So we're gonna try and we're gonna treat the opportunity as a function of their position in various networks. One of which is going to be the industry network. Another is going to be the prior education affiliation network. People went to school together, alumni networks. Another will be prior employment network. People used to work together. Yeah. Okay. All right. So we're going to do this in the U.S. venture capital industry. This is an industry that I got to know really well as a doctoral student at Berkeley. I was in Silicon Valley, and I figured I'm going to study this Silicon Valley thing. And I went in to study venture capital decision making, and that lasted about 6 months of venture capitalists telling me, "Look, guy, I don't know how we make decisions," you know, and me trying to find some way to justify the 1 hour I'd spent driving down there to interview them. And I got them to start telling fundraising war stories about how they pitched the Harvard endowment and got 10 million. They were very happy to tell me those stories. And so I learned a lot about fundraising and kind of the role of networks in getting access to capital and deploying that capital too. And so this is something I've been thinking about for almost 2 decades now, trying to test this because I felt like I saw the old boys club of venture capital. And I felt like my dissertation addressed some of that, but not as much as I'd wanted to. And it's really only been in the last few years when I was able to convince Brenda to work with me on this, and some of the performance data is actually, manifested that we could actually do this study. Yeah. So let me tell you a little bit about this. Is data from my dissertation. All right. So what this is just this is like the rankings, right? The rankings of any university or school, except here I'm ranking them based on the prior education and prior employment affiliations of about 8,000, and this is private equity, not just venture capital investors, at over 1,000 firms, and it's 1 year of data. All right, so to do this, I had a small army of undergraduate RAs coding industry directories and websites. Now you can just download the data from PitchBook or scrape LinkedIn. It's a lot easier. In retrospect, I should have monetized this, as a doctoral student, but I did not. Instead, I wrote 2 papers. That, and here we are. So here, let's take, for example, Harvard, okay? There are nearly 1,500 affiliated individuals, where an affiliation is just you hold at least 1 degree. If you have like an MBA, JD, MD, it's still just 1 affiliation regardless of the number of degrees. All right, so what this is telling us is that about 1,500 of the 8,000, all right, or 18%, have a degree from Harvard, okay? And if we look at this list of schools, this is just like the US News and World Report top university rankings. It's not at all surprising. But if we look at the concentration, we see 40% of US private equity investors have a degree from 1 of 3 schools. And I've tried many times, and audience members have tried many more times than me, to come up with a story whereby, like, we can say that, the difference between University of Pennsylvania and Columbia in terms of, the quality of their students, the quality of their curriculum, or their preparation for venture capital or private equity investing careers is like 2x better at Penn than it is at Columbia. All right. And you can take similar pairwise comparisons, Harvard, MIT, Stanford, Berkeley, right? Geographically proximate. It's hard to come up with a story by which this is really about differences in students or the training they receive. All right. And what seems like a more, and you see over here in terms of the prior employment, there's similar concentration. These figures are smaller, primarily because there's 1,100 schools and 13,000 employers in the data. So there's order of magnitude difference there. And so the story that I think makes sense is that these networks are important. They're important for getting access to employment opportunities. They're getting access to capital and getting access to investment opportunities. And these are the kinds of stories that the venture capitalists I interviewed were very happy to tell me about their friends that they were doing deals with, and why they trusted each other, et cetera, okay? And to give you the empirical punchline here, this is just simple descriptive statistics, right? This is there are some dyadic models in here, like classic network models, but this is far easier to interpret. If we take those 8,000 people, each of whom could work with the other 7,999, all right? We get 64 million dyads, IJ is JI, so there's only 32 million. And we just take the descriptive statistics. All we know is like they have a degree from the same institution, or they both worked at the same employer. It doesn't even have to be at the same time. I don't have graduation dates or dates of employment in this data, all right? If all we know is that they attended the same institution and got a degree there at some point, there's almost like a 2x higher likelihood that they're going to work at the same firm, okay? Employment, it's much greater, right? So having worked at Goldman Sachs or McKinsey or one of these, top employers, or really just any shared employer, it's almost 10x, right? And these are additive, all right? Not necessarily multiplicative, but being embedded in these networks is critical to getting an employment opportunity, to working in one of these firms, right? And so we take that, all right? This is the networks by which you get a job, all right? Well, what do you do with the capital once you get it? Well, now we can take this, that's the individual level. This is the firm level, all right? So we take those, oh gosh, what did I say? There were, how many dyads? There were like 11. I can't remember the statistics now. Anyway, we create nearly 600,000 firm dyads, right? And so here, for example, if firm I has 2 Michigan graduates, firm J has 3, then they share 6 affiliations, all right? Each of the 2 is affiliated with each of the 3, and that's how the bins are defined here. And all this shows is that co-investment rate between firms increases as we know that those firms share more and more of the same affiliations, both with respect to education and employment, okay? And once you do this in a multivariate regression format where you account for their location, how far apart are they from each other, are they investing in the same industries or sectors or stages, et cetera, those effects still are very strong, all right? And so the key takeaway here for me was that, look, these firms are using the same networks to source capital, employment, and investment opportunities. How do you break into this industry, right? These are substantial barriers to entry that are really social structural in nature. It's not about regulation or anything like that. And so this is something that I've thought a lot about over the years. And what's not in this data that we now have, because of work that Brenda did, is we have social identity data. We can do this algorithmically using surnames and things like that to infer racialized identities, ethnicities, gender, et cetera, okay? And so none of that is in here, all right? I'll show you some of what we do have and all these ideas we might have about how we could define and document the old boys club of the industry. It turns out it's hard to do empirically because there's such little diversity within the industry on these dimensions. And I'll show you some of that data in a minute, okay? All right, so this is where things will get complicated. I'll try and keep it clear, at least the intuition, all right? So what we're gonna do is 2 sets of analyses, okay? So one is, our stories about access to opportunities or selecting opportunities. Well, that means we need a way to characterize opportunities. In this context, an opportunity is a deal, all right? You can invest in this deal. It's like the 3rd round of investment in this biotech startup company in Fremont, California, okay? And so what we're gonna do is model the probability that it has an exit event. That deal ends in initial public offering or an acquisition. They vary in terms of how successful they are, right? Some IPOs are good, or they're not so great, acquisitions the same. But we don't have the valuations or any kind of data like that allows us to do this more than dichotomously. Basically, you can think of this as, do the investors get at least some of their money back, right? Which is generally a good indicator in the industry of success, okay? And so we're gonna retain the predicted values as an index of deal quality, and we're going to stratify deals in the industry based on how likely they are to have a successful liquidity event. Yes. Please. Yeah. Yeah.
Networks are not sending files, they put people in order to deal with.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think I'll justify this context. If anywhere, we should be able to observe and test these ideas here. The extent to which it generalizes elsewhere, I agree. There are probably some boundary conditions related to information asymmetry, trust, et cetera, et cetera. But if we think the networks produce inequalities because of that, then this is probably a good context to test that. Well, I believe we can, or I believe that I can persuade a large number of people, well, actually at least 2 or 3 reviewers and an editor, that we can infer merit or privilege. I don't think it's ever going to be unequivocal, certainly not. But I've never done anything that is, yeah. All right, so we're going to try to characterize the quality of these opportunities. This is, admittedly, this is a little bit controversial. This is me saying with my regressions, I can predict like good venture capital investments to make. Why do we need a venture capitalist? Yeah. Surprisingly, you can generate pretty good R-squareds with some very basic descriptive statistics, which, on second thought, makes me think the question's worth asking. All right. I don't mention that in my Silicon Valley interviews, though. All right. In terms of the deal performance analysis, well, then we're going to look at, okay, let's take all these deals. And a nice thing about this structure is that because they're co-investing, that is, there could be like 5 firms invested in the same deal, you have the opportunity to extract some firm fixed effects from this because you get so many observations where you can difference out each firm's independent contribution to a deal or independent returns. Once we condition on, I, J, K, and L have all been in this deal, and now J, K, M, and P have been in that deal. All right. So what we do here is we estimate a series of regressions where we do or do not include firm fixed effects, and we look at how the residuals behave. All right. The idea being here that the firms are consistently outperforming the competition. Well, in strategy, that's what matters, performance differentials, right? Well, that tells us there is indeed something systematic here. It doesn't tell us whether that's, a privileged story about superior opportunities or a merit story about superior capabilities. But if we could take these fixed effect and then we drop that out and then we look at the residuals, that is the unobserved variance, well, if that is systematically related, well, that suggests that some firms are just better conditional on observables at producing performance. And that does seem more consistent with the merit story. Okay, so we're going to try and infer merit and privilege from how we interpret the firm fixed effects and the residuals in these regressions. Make sense? Yes, please.
What is PIT here?
Oh, performance of the deal I at time T.
What is
Yeah, it'll be the exit.
What is it? Then what is
Yeah.
Q?
That's the quality from the deal regression. That's the predicted value. So we're going to index the performance of deals that conditional on observables have similar expected performance.
Okay. Performance is whether or not they get acquired.
That's right. Or initial public offering. Yes. So I should clarify that. Here, you can have a really high predicted deal value, but not actually ever experience IPO because it's a rare event. Actually, most of the ones with high values don't experience IPO or even acquisition. And so there's a lot of variation around that predicted value, but we're going to try and condition on that as the quality of the opportunity available to that firm. Yeah.
So quality of
That's right.
QI.
That's right.
Like
Yeah. What's that? Yes. This is this is where my notation in PowerPoint gets really messy. Yeah. every time I present this, I realize there's something else I need to include in the equation. But I also feel like if I don't put the equations, it's harder to understand. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure that they're gonna have a fixed effect that's positive necessarily merit, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you're just making kind of the most conservative case possible.
If we could get a firm fixed effect that is uniformly positive or negative, that could be consistent with either the privilege mechanism of access or the merit mechanism of selection or development. That's sort of what we need to show that there is a firm level basis for this that needs to be explained. I'll get to that in a moment. Yeah. Okay, now it gets really complicated if that wasn't enough. All right. Let me explain the data and then the measures will make a little more sense. Okay. So what we're going to do is over 2 decades, we can look at, almost 3,000 new entrants. These are firms that raise their first fund. They enter the industry. They have several, typically like 50 to $500 million, right, to invest. And they do 51,000 deals out of the 188,000 that are done in the industry. They participate in those deals. This is because the new firms tend to be smaller. All right, smaller firms tend to participate in earlier stage deals, which cost less capital or which require less capital to invest in. Yeah. And so for them, we have about 5,000 some firm personnel of 36,000 in the industry. And we use algorithmic name classification to infer gender and ethnicity. All right. This is, there are obvious problems with using algorithms to predict this. We're not necessarily trying to test the effects of this, but I do think it's a useful control at minimum. All right, especially because the literature has previously ignored everything about identity in terms of these firm level network studies. And I'll show you why, because there's such limited diversity, I wouldn't want to test anything related to these variables in this context anyway. And then we get prior education and employment data from both PitchBook and LinkedIn. All right. And so here we're going to model that deal performance is, do you get an exit? All right. And there's some literature in finance that demonstrates that basically whatever network centrality measure you you can use betweenness, eigenvector, Bonasich, whatever your favorite is. They're basically also highly correlated with degree, that you get similar effects in terms of position performance relationship. We'll show you results with Bonasich, just because that's most commonly used in the literature. Yeah. All right. Oh, it does that. Okay. In terms of the deal quality analysis, all right, so here's where we're going to try and condition the opportunities. We have, Brenda, I need to remember to, yes, there is a deal that was done in like 1856. It's like, yeah, we need to change that to the modern era, like 1978, yeah, or something, yeah. All right, so there are over almost 100,000 firms investing in over 124,000 ventures. And you can see the geographic distribution. Most of these, or not most, the modal firm is located in California. There's also Massachusetts, Texas, New York. That's generally where they are. And you can see the industry distribution. It's largely software deals, biopharma, finance, energy. These tend to be higher capital deals. And so at a deal level perspective, software has a lower entry barrier to investing. So there are more deals, okay? Now, in terms of the X's we're going to use here to get our, I should say that's Q hat, yeah? All right, we're going to put location as in state fixed effects, industry dummies, all right? That is the industries in which the focal firm lists. Whether or not we have investor information on the deal, there are some in there that we don't know who the investors are, largely because they're individuals. Sometimes someone like Bill Gates invests and they're not listed in the database, but there's $10 million of Bill Gates money there. So that'll be just a 0-1. The year of the first investment, the deal year, because each focal company startup can get multiple rounds of financing. And, generally a third round deal is less risky than a first round deal. because it will pass some milestones along the way. Deal round and venture age. The reason here is that there are boom and bust cycles in the industry. And so like, you know, if you got capital in like 1999, right before the dot-com bubble burst, I don't know, does anyone still remember that? Okay. Or like right before the financial crisis, and that's also a long time ago now. Right before versus right after, there's a lot of difference in quality. It was a lot harder to raise capital after these negative events. And so they were generally viewed as better deals, weaker deals. So you have to have like a vintage year fixed effect in these regressions. But once you do that, what we do is we borrow this approach that it's this project called the Startup Cartography Project, where they're trying to estimate entrepreneurial quality across communities in the United States using very basic data available when a firm applies for a business license or registers with the tax authority. And so we borrow that approach. It's very simple, and these observables, however, can produce an R squared of the range of like 0.2, 0.25, which I think is pretty good considering how coarse this is, and of course, how much of the true quality is unobservable in archival data. Yeah, Robert.
So I agree that that's pretty good. But I guess it seems like given what the observables are, it seems like that might be supposed to be just capturing that like the startup world had a bubble, and then is that sort of what you're getting at with these, or do you think you're getting sort of quality?
I think we're getting more. Yeah. So the question is, another way of asking the question is, there's a lot of that R squared just based on the deal year. Yeah, or the vintage year. I don't know how much. I would have to look at it. I think that it's probably more about the industry here.
But it seems like the observables are things that are not really observables of the venture quality. They're observable of the sort of like the situation.
The deal's probability of success. Yeah. Yeah. It'd be nice if we had a measure of quality, though. If I did, I'd probably have a different career. Yeah. Okay. So here, let me give you a sense of what's in the data. So this is the kernel density plot of centrality in the prior education affiliation network. So this is Bonasich centrality, where we, you know, 2 Michigan grads, 3 Michigan grads, 6 shared affiliations. We take that affiliation, 2-mode affiliation matrix, put it into the 1-mode firm. And what you see is that there's this long right tail, all right? Those that are central, highly central, are very, very more central than others. That's how it's distributed, all right? And you get the similar shape distribution regardless of what network centrality measure you use. So in many ways, this is really a test of the haves versus the have-nots, right? Those that are like central and everyone else, okay? In terms of educational prestige, you remember the table I showed you earlier? Here we scale this so that the max university world ranking figure is 1,000, all right? And the median here is 994. So you could think of this as the median investor at the median firm graduated from the 6th ranked school in the world. Okay. And so, you know, if we think of this as, you know, are these effects just picking up the effects of like Ivy League graduation, you know, or alumni networks, that alone is insufficient to really structurally differentiate yourself from others in the industry, right? It's because the prestige is sort of like a selection criteria to get into the industry in the first place. Once you do, there's very little differentiation on that in the industry. All right, so this is one reason why I want to say, if this is about like capabilities, like some schools are just better at preparing than others, there's such little variation here that we have to believe that difference between like Penn and Columbia really is on the order of 2x. If you want to, you know, say that. But if someone wants to, we can have that discussion. We're going to control for educational prestige whenever we estimate something related to education centrality. Okay. Okay. And given the shape of those distributions, you can see why they're not perfectly correlated, right? In terms of ascribed characteristics, this is the kernel density plot of the percentage of investors that our algorithm has identified as most likely a white person, all right? And you can see that the median firm that enters is identified as 100% white and 100% men, all right? using the gender classification. Of course, there's some errors that are probably inflating the predictions of white or men here, but I don't think that they're going to change the shape of that distribution very much at all. All right. So this is something that, I had wanted to do more work related to some of these social identity dimensions here with the data, and we might still do that. But when I saw this, I realized that, we're not going to have a whole lot of variation, unfortunately, especially with the newer. On the one hand, the newer entrants tend to be more diverse than prior entrants, but they're also much smaller. And so it's generally when firms get bigger that they add more people, that their membership starts to diversify. So there's this competing effect of like the new entrants being more diverse, but also having fewer opportunities to diversify statistically. Yeah. Okay. So just to, I also move this forward, Brenda. This is something we used to do at the end, but I think it's nice, what economists will call prima facie evidence, that we get a sense of like what's driving that performance effect by doing this. Those of you who've done a Oaxaca blinder wage decomposition or a Kitagawa decomposition, that what we oftentimes want to do is see how much of the variation in an outcome, like wages or earnings, is attributable to the X's versus the betas, right? And so that's what we're going to do here is say, look, let's take some of our firms that we know are really high performers. So you have to make a binary distinction, right? Because they're really highly central, say in the higher education network, or they're really prestigious in terms of their educational prestige, and we just dichotomize them, all right? And we just look at how much of the variation in performance is attributable to the X's versus the betas, all right? So that's what we're going to do here with respect to prior education centrality. We're going to take those that, they come from those schools that are, at the top of the list versus everyone else. And we're going to decompose the variation in deal performance, that is the likelihood of achieving an IPO or acquisition, based on the deal observables versus the betas, okay? And it's not exactly a match, one-to-one match to opportunities and capabilities for reasons I'll discuss. But if we take here, we decompose that for firms that are split above and below the median on that prior education network centrality. This just decomposes this for what is explained versus unexplained, all right? And, oh gosh, I cut off the x-axis. Did I do that? I think I did. Okay. Brenda, do you recall the x-axis here? Yeah, sorry. So either way, the variation in performance is largely attributable to the explained, all right, the X's. That if we look at firms that are performing really, really well, all right, a lot of this is whether we think this is access, which many in the industry will say like, hey, we'd love to do that deal, but we can't get in, right? Or we think this is about selection. Yeah, we chose that deal. We had, we looked at a lot of companies in that space, and this is the one we chose. The vast majority of it is explained by the X's, right? As opposed to what we might think of as capabilities, at least development capabilities, we should say. The X's also pick up on selection. It's prestige, that's right, okay. This is the prior education centrality, this is the prestige, yeah. I didn't want to say it because then I would be confusing it every time I mentioned it thereafter. So whether we're talking about, structural position or like prestigious perception of quality, it's really a matter of the deals that they do, okay? And so now we really need to focus on, is it because they have access to better deals, privilege, superior opportunities, or is it because they make better choices, superior capabilities or merit, okay? And so that's why I bring this forward now, because it kind of gives a sense of, in terms of mechanism, what we would need to explain everything that comes hereafter. It has to be about the deals that they do, the opportunities they have, okay? All right, so now the analytical approach. Okay, we got a half hour, yeah? Yeah, okay, good. All right, We're going to reproduce the position performance relationship. We're just going to take the performance of a deal in the next period based on its observables and the firm's network centrality, all right, at time t, all right. Then we're going to estimate our deal quality here, all right, as a function of deal observables. I should make that a Q hat, note to self on the recording, okay. All right, so let's just do that. This is bond centrality on the X, performance on the Y, all right, the predicted number of exits for a firm, all right, conditional on, you know, the deals it does, et cetera, okay, and this is just consistent with prior research. Like the stylized version of the graph I showed you before, the performance is generally increasing with position, okay, yeah.
So this, in this case, the centrality is co-investment.
Co-investment centrality, that's right, that's right, yes. That is, we take all the firms that are doing deals, all right, and the firms that do deals with more central firms end up having higher co-investment centrality. It's correlated with prior education and prior employment centrality, but it's a different measure. Yeah.
This is like replicating the previous finding.
Yeah, it's yeah.
And you're not, as opposed to what you're going to do later, where you're like, we're focusing on interest,
Yeah.
therefore you probably wouldn't co-investment centrality.
They don't have a yeah, that's right.
Do we care about the count here on the y-axis or like the rate?
Yeah, I mean, you could do that as an exit rate as well. You're going to get the same upward sloping relationship. Of course, the y-axis changes, slope changes still. Yeah.
That's to say it's not just these are bigger.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. Yeah. You could also condition, I don't think we do here, but there's some models where people will condition on the number of deals that a firm has done on the right-hand side as well. I'm just trying to show that our data behaves much like everyone else's here. It's kind of an uninteresting finding in the literature, but I think it's necessary to show. Yeah. All right. So let's go to that. So we do this, you know, kind of controversial thing where we're saying we can predict deal quality based on observables at the time a deal is done. All right. This is the kernel density plot. You can see we've got also a long right tail in terms of the predicted value. That's the predicted likelihood of realizing an initial public offering or acquisition. Okay, a successful deal. And just in terms of face validity, if we take, you know, well, what percentage of those deals that we put in each quartile bin actually has a successful outcome? You can see that, you know, we've got good face validity here. Those that are in, you know, the top bin do tend to exit at higher rates. So this is, you also get the sense this is really about selecting the best deals out of the bunch, right? The most promising ones. Okay, so in terms of deal quality, this is why we feel, you know, in addition to the R squared, why we feel like this is a reasonable proxy for an opportunity's quality, all right? And then the question becomes, who's getting access or who's selecting these deals out here? Once you see this, it seems pretty obvious that we should know, conditional on observables, which ones are likely to be out here, all right? Though, even among these, there's selection to be done, okay? All right, so now to get into the mechanisms to Sasha's question. So now what we want to do is estimate performance, all right? PIT, that is how well that deal does, all right? I should make that T+1, all right? Based on the quality of the deal, that should be a Q hat, okay? And then we're going to estimate this firm fixed effect, all right? We're going to extract that out and infer from that which firms tend to outperform what you would expect, conditional on the observables of the deals that they do, all right? That is, some firms are systematically doing better than you would expect, all right? Other firms are doing systematically worse, yeah? And so we're going to first extract that, okay? Then we're going to re-estimate that. We're going to remove the fixed effect, the firm fixed effect, all right? And re-estimate that and then extract the residual, all right? That is the residual performance from the deal, okay? How much performance is not explained, all right, by the deals themselves, okay? And so once we do that, we can stratify both the firm fixed effect and the residual by those characteristics Z, all right? Here, it's going to be largely their prior education network centrality, because that's where we have sort of the best distribution, okay, given quality. So if we see that, okay, look, the firm fixed effects and the residuals are systematically varying, that doesn't tell us if it's merit or privilege. It's actually consistent with both accounts, all right? But both accounts imply that we should see systematic variation across firms in both of these measures, yeah? And so then what we're going to do is look more closely at the residuals, all right? And we're going to do some subsample analyses by deal round, where later deals, we know, sort of mechanically have a higher rate of success than earlier round deals because you have to pass through each round to get to IPO or acquisition, right? And so is there some sort of sorting going on here? And then we're also going to model those initial relationships, right? So, you know, to Robert's question, firm enters the industry, they have no relationships, you know, at least firm relationships yet. And so who are their first co-investors, right? It's sort of like, you know, you get to do the deal with like the high status firm in the industry, and this is like an endorsement of your quality, et cetera, versus you're breaking in on the outside, okay? And we might consider that as evidence of superior opportunities. All right, so let's get into it, all right? So these are bin scatter plots. In addition to kernel density plots, these are my favorites. All they are taking firm fixed effects that are coming from the deal performance regressions, right? And just binning those firm fixed effect estimates by the firm's centrality in the prior education network, by their percentage of members who are identified algorithmically as men, and the percentage of members who are identified algorithmically as white investors, okay? And so you can see here that we have some modest correlations in terms of the social identity variables. There's a stronger correlation here, though it's, you know, admittedly somewhat skewed by this outlying bin, right? Because of the shape, right? There's a correlation between being central in that prior education network. And again, this is not just having gone to a prestigious school, because the vast majority of them can make that claim. It's about being central, connected to those who are otherwise central in the prior education network. And so this is the one we're going to focus on because it seems to have the strongest effect on deal performance, okay? And, you know, admittedly, because we have such very little variation on those other two, yeah? All right, so this tells us nothing about mechanisms, all right? But it does tell us that, like, any story about why some firms that are more central are outperforming those that are more peripheral that relates to education is going to have to focus on the opportunities they have access to or select, and how well they perform conditional on that. And so that's what we're going to try to do. All right. So before I do that, let me show you. This is prior education centrality. This is prior employment. We're still working on the data collection for this because there's like several 100,000 different prior employers, and the name matching is mind-boggling. But here, what we see is if we take the co-investment centrality of each new entrant's first partner, first co-investor, well, we can see that, you know, this is skewed a lot by the really, really central or elite, all right? Otherwise, it's not really positive. Here, it's a similar story, all right? So for us, this tells us, and you know, this is still preliminary because we're still trying to collect the data on unemployment. That's probably about like 30% of the total firms. It's not clear that this is about getting access to the most central co-investors, okay? That's not obvious from this. It might be once we condition on other covariates in a regression framework, but the descriptives suggest it's not, okay? All right. And we get a similar story when we look at the social identity variables, gender and racialized identity. It's very modest correlations, okay? There might be something here, but from our perspective, the descriptives don't suggest that this is likely a core part of the story, okay? What does come out more clear is if we take the relationship between prior education centrality and the firm fixed effects for early stage deals, right, this is where the information asymmetry is highest. We know nothing about this. Versus round 3, well, we've gone through a few rounds of investment. They've made some leadership changes. We now have a product. There's some revenue, et cetera, to, well, we're scaling up, all right? Well, we can see that that correlation between prior education centrality and the firm fixed effects gets stronger as we get into the later rounds than in the earlier rounds. And because we know, at least, you know, the way the regression is set up, later stage deals are more likely to be successful than early stage deals because there's a selection at each stage. Well, a lot of the superior performance is really attributable to getting to access to deals that are more likely to be successful. All right. So we interpret this as consistent with superior access. You could say that, well, these firms just choose the strategy to focus on later stage deals, but I'm pretty sure that's what all of them would do if they had enough capital to do so. All right. That's my interpretation, that this is really about being able to do deals that are less risky. To me, that's an access to opportunity story. Okay. There is also an access to capital story that enables that. Yeah. But to me, that's probably the strongest evidence we can show you that's consistent with the privilege story. Okay. So far. Yeah. All right, so we see that this deal quality is correlated with ascribed and achieved characteristics. There's some evidence of superior opportunities or privilege, but what about the merit or capability story? And so for us, the best way to test this that we can think of thus far is to take those residuals, right? And the idea is this. If a firm is consistently outperforming, its deals end up doing better than anyone would have thought based on the deal observables at the time the deal was done, well, they must be pretty good at their jobs. All right. This is how I would want to be tested. Do I take, you know, inputs that produce better outputs than someone who has the same inputs? Okay. This is the most straightforward test I could think of for the merit story. Admittedly, it's not ideal, right, for a variety of reasons, which we'll get into. All right. So what we do here is now we've been scatter plots the firm level residuals as a function of prior education centrality, percentage of investors who are men, percentage who are white investors. Basically, we have 0 correlations here across all of them. There is no evidence that these firms are systematically outperforming beyond what you would expect conditional on the deal level observables. And in some ways, I'm surprised by this. I thought there would be some modest positive correlations here. And so part of me feels like we're missing something. But on the other hand, if I can't get this, it's hard to really say that they're like weaving straw into gold here. It's inconsistent with the superior opportunity development capability. And so what that suggests to me is that the performance differential story here, those that are in more advantageous structural position, it has to be about the opportunities that they have access to or select. And so what we really need to test that is some way of making, either by assumption or measurement, a way of characterizing what deals they could have done and selecting from that set the deals that they actually did do. Yes, you've got an idea for that?
How can I make a lot of money out of pretty much I put in and return,
Yeah,
but also my share of the overall thing.
yeah,
Stop other people
yeah.
think about my posting. Where is that captured?
That data is unavailable. Yeah, so having spent a lot of time with these investors, that's where the real money is made. Writing the deal so that if anything bad happens, I get my money back before anyone else does. And if anything good happens, I get a slightly better deal than everyone else. You need to actually have the contracts, the term sheets to get at that, and that's not publicly available. Yeah.
I'm going to put this money and cannot be my share by adding. So
Yeah. Yeah, so that's that shows up in the later deals, like the later rounds, right? That's right. Well,
Rather than background.
yeah. So access conditional on access to capital. Yeah. That you have to have a lot of capital to invest in the later rounds because the valuations go up exponentially. And so to maintain your equity stake in like, a $10 billion valuation versus a $10 million valuation, orders of magnitude. Yeah. So that's where it shows up. And I do think that's an access story. I don't think that's a strategy. Which sounds odd, I think, for a business school professor to say, but yeah. Okay. So, I have one more here. Yeah. Okay. So now, okay. We could do this alternative. If you don't like our residual approach, you like, look, I just show me the firm fixed effects. There's some people who prefer that to the residuals because residuals are, who knows what's in the residuals. All right, we can do a median split on the firm fixed effects. That is, those firms that they're always outperforming their observables versus underperforming, right? And if you want to interpret those fixed effects as capabilities, well, here's what we can show you. That those that are high versus low, this is the predicted, that should be not probability, predicted value of deal quality, all right? That those that are high on capabilities are investing in, I should say, high quality deals. All right, that's the huge difference. And it's a matter of whether or not we think that's an access story or selection story. All right. Here, if we look at the residuals, you don't see that. Okay. That is, if we take those high capability firms, that have the high firm fixed effect, there's nothing about the residuals that implies that. So what we would need is a story by which they're selecting on observables, not on unobservables, if this is about selection capabilities. And it's hard for me to come up with a story given the nature of asymmetric information, private information. That's what this industry is all about, is trading on private information. It's basically legalized insider trading, all right, that comes up with a story by which they're not selecting on all that private information they have access to. Instead, they're selecting on the pretty basic firm demographic variables that I can download from PitchBook, all right? Yeah, from the deal performance regression. No, we remove the firm fixed effect. Yeah. Well, yeah. 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 And
Statistically, it's false.
yeah, that's what we remove the firm fixed effect when doing this. Yeah. We don't estimate it. Yeah. 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 It might be about the distribution across the two and the high low. We have to look at that. That's the only thing I can think of is the binary split we've done here on the firm fixed effect. Yeah. Yeah. No, that I need to go back and look at the code. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That seems pretty unlikely.
Yeah.
If they're like all very close to zero,
Yeah. I mean,
that seems like
yeah. Yeah. It might be. Let's go back and check that, Brenda. We've done this several ways, both with and without the firm fixed effect, because we had this sort of like, well, what should our expectation really be here? In any case, all right. So this is why, I'm not sure that it's the fairest test we can come up with. I'm not sure it's a fair test. All right. But to recap, this idea, the functionalist story about, superior capabilities and merit is really like they're better at their jobs, and therefore that's why they're outperforming. I feel like we've made a good faith effort to test that, looking at the residuals, looking at the firm fixed effects, looking at the sorting into deals with higher or lower expected quality. All right. And we prefer the interpretation that this is really about access to opportunities as opposed to selecting the best deals, though admittedly, we should probably at least make some assumptions about the choices available to them and the ones that they actually make. So we're probably going to do some case control sampling on the deals that they do, and model the selection a little bit to see if those firms that do have those better fixed effects do tend to choose better ones, though the access story would also produce similar results there. So I'm not sure that's going to really work well for us. But for the most part, the way that the empirical analyses, the results fall out, it suggests to us that this is more about access to opportunity than it is about developing opportunities, for sure. Whether or not it's access or selection to opportunities seems to be the critical answer. And in terms of things we're doing next, trying to work on that case control sampling and choice models. We're trying to get it more proposition or mechanism specific tests. Brendan and I have talked a lot about the different ones. We're not quite happier with any of them than we are with what we've done. And we've got some folks working on prior employer coding so we can see if those results are similar to the education ones. And all other great ideas will certainly be accepted and implemented. Yeah. Thanks so much for your engagement.